Welcome to Finlos Asks. I'm excited to introduce you to Virgil Suárez, novelist, poet, and professor of creative writing at Florida State University. His works appear in numerous anthologies in addition to his own standalone collections, and he has been recognized internationally for his literary contributions. Suárez is most commonly associated with an honest and cinematic writing voice, a drive for artistic verve, and as a leading voice in the Latinx and Cuban American literary landscapes. I first met Virgil when I was an undergrad in the creative writing program at FSU, and among the other workshops, his were always the most productive because he was supportive, available, and demanded respect and participation from all members of the class. And he did so without the pretension and self-promotion that can too often occur in writing programs. Virgil would continue to welcome me to advanced writing workshops at the master's and PhD level even after I left the fine arts programs, and pushed me to explore voices and techniques that were challenging, but ultimately made me a better writer, reader, and teacher of the writing process. In this interview, you'll hear Suárez discuss his memories of leaving Cuba as Castro rose to power, maintaining continuity with family and creative endeavors, and why most days you can find him wearing sweatpants and t-shirts.
I'm going to be 61 this coming 29th in 2023. I was born in 62. My parents got me out of the country. I was born in 62. I left Cuba, I want to say, between 1970 and 72. The story is a little unclear because my dad died. My mom's memory, although good, she falters here and there a little bit. So I'm pretty sure I was out of Cuba by 72. And the marker for me was that I remember them talking about the 10 million ton sugarcane cutting contest, which wasn't a contest. It was mandatory work for people. But to be nice, whoever the 4 or 6 guys with the largest number of cut sugarcane would get TVs, something like that, Russian-made TVs. So I remember that. So I'm pretty sure I left between 70 and 72. We went to Spain, where I spent 2 years. And Spain to me was, even though it wasn't a language issue that I would later have in the United States, it was weird because come to find out that the reason why we got out of Cuba was that Cuba and the United States, after the Bay of Pigs, their relationships went down the toilet. So somehow, about 100,000 of us who had applied for visas and wanted to get out of Cuba and come to the United States had to be housed for a couple of years, like a screening process. Mm-hmm. In Spain, Franco was still alive. So, the kids picked on me in school and all of that because the thing was that, one dictator kind of supporting another dictator, right?
Sure.
But most of what I remember about Spain was really idyllic. It was the first time that I ate an apple. Right. It was the first time that I ate pears and grapes, and that I had Hot Wheels and Matchbox little cars that I loved. And so I started collecting stamps. I mean, I really liked the country. And again, language was not an issue. So finally, my father gets a great job working for Colgate. He had the maintenance contract for one building, and then they gave him the contract for the other building. So we were doing well. And sure enough, as soon as we started doing really well, the visa came in to come to the United States. They entertained rather, the idea of maybe staying in Spain. But, my mother said immediately no, because we have all of our family was already in the United States on my father's side, not my mother's. So anyway, come to Miami for about a month, long enough for me to fall in love with Miami, right?
And this is the mid-70s?
I would say this was about 74, 75. Planet of the Apes was on, and even though I didn't understand it, I was hooked. Star Trek. I mean, there were a bunch of things that I really liked. And of course, I liked my cousins. It was idyllic. Then a friend of my father called them up and said, look, because there was no jobs. It was a tough economic time in Miami. Nobody was getting jobs. And so this friend of my dad's called them and said, come to California. We've got an apartment for you. It's furnished. And come and stay. So I didn't want to go, but we went. We went. And I don't know, I can't remember. I want to say we drove, and then what little we had was either shipped. Anyway, wake up in LA, as much as I remember. Monday comes, I have to go and enroll in school. My parents came with me, signed all the papers, blah, blah, blah. I was wearing a 3-piece denim suit, okay, with a little vest and everything, and these big-ass shoes. So at this point, unbeknownst to me, it's my 4th period, which was my official entrance into that school, Henry T. Gage Junior High School in Los Angeles, LA Unified School District, was physical education. I mean, it's just how things didn't line up correctly. It was physical education. It was towards the end of the 4th period when finally somebody walked me to the locker rooms. And then, and I didn't speak a word of English, it was about, you need to take off your clothes. You need to take off your clothes because we do physical education, which I never understood. And also now you have to shower, so you arrived already at the end. And so they stripped me naked, threw me into these showers with another 100 kids who were in 4th period PE. I came out of there shocked and scarred. I mean, I was crying.
Yeah.
So I came home and I told my parents, I go, this is horrible. They made me take off my clothes. I had to, and they go, what? So then they came back with me the next day. And I don't know if the principal showed them the California health code, but everybody had to shower.
Right.
If you were, so my struggle in school from then on was, how do I go through school and avoid having to take communal showers with people I don't know, you know, and also
because there was no transition. It was just right into the deep end.
No transition. It was like I was birthed into a stinky, moldy, shower area with these tiny little white tiles. The smell of ammonia, because that's what they would clean, with these drains in the middle of it. And it was horror. On top of that, I had to share my locker with some other kid who later on I found out was a gang member. And I mean, the guy was maybe, he was a lot smaller than I was, but he had me so intimidated that I basically got a backpack and I just kept,
everything with you.
Very little in that. And then I gave him the locker because I didn't want to be dealing with it. And that was it. The other thing that I realized, and I'm glad it happened, was that I needed to fend for myself, which meant that I needed the language. So I very quickly, within a period of about 8 months, I started to learn enough English to tell people, hey, I don't like that. Or like one guy offered me, which is funny because it was also my idea, right? It was the first time that I thought, oh my God, I'm probably going to have to communicate from now on bilingually, because there was a Mexican kid who spoke English, but he was offering me mota, which is weed, right? And I had no idea what the mota for Cubans is. The powder puff that your mother uses to put powder on, you know? So I go, okay, so I'm going to have to learn quite a bit here. But sure enough, I think within the year I was conversant in English, and I took off from there. The other thing that happened was that I realized that if I asked permission of my teachers to stay in the classroom, during those class breaks, it would be okay, so that I wouldn't have to be in the hallways or in the general population. So I sought refuge always in the classroom. Now, lately, to answer your question about how coming to the United States, I'm an only child, so I've begun to think about parenting and the responsibility of parents when you have a child who is not going to have consent until they turn 18. At least it's so in this country. In other countries, it's even longer than that. But I realized, my parents, their reason for getting me out of Cuba was that that they were afraid that I would be conscripted into the military and sent off to fight in Angola, which was a very messy war, and it killed a lot of young Cuban guys, right? So luckily, they got me out of there. And along with it came all of the baggage, the reasons why they left, the reasons, And as you grow up, you begin to realize that now this is the world of politics, right? People come into power, people vote for certain people, other people don't. And so you get to this point where you say, okay, my father had been okay with the previous government, which was Batista's government, but he's not okay with Castro's government, and he doesn't like it, and he feels threatened, so we get out, right? And this is the difference having a dictatorship, is that with a dictatorship, change is not going to come, and often never comes from inside unless there's a civil war or a coup, and that is never going to happen in Cuba. But here in the United States, right, we have these parties, we vote for people, and sometimes we get the people that we don't like, and we certainly didn't vote for. But there's always the idea that change is coming in 4 years, at least at the presidential level. I think senators are 6, and House of Representatives are every 2 years, which is way too fast. But anyway, I started thinking, maybe as I grew older and read a lot more of the history, my parents got me out of Cuba simply because they wanted to get out, and nobody really wants to leave their country, but I understand their rationale, right? But, and not that I don't think of myself as a communist, because I'm not, but I kind of understand what happens in countries where people eventually get fed up. And their best scenario is to elect and prop up some dictator that's gonna, and I'm realized that now with the Cubans in Miami, which are totally in love with Trump, and I don't understand.
Right.
I don't understand why that would be. You left a country that was run by, of course, Castro's been dead for a while, but I'm now talking about his brother, and then it's gonna be the grandchildren, and it's a family run business disguised as a government, because that's what it is. So I'm thinking, I don't understand why you would vote for Trump, and they will tell you because he's a strong man, right? He is, and I realize that Cubans, and maybe that's becoming true of Americans, it probably already is. People don't want to think. People often want the choice. That's the difference between us and a place like Cuba, where you might get a fake sense of a choice, but here allegedly you have a choice. To me, it seems to be the same crap. But granted, I exercise my right to vote, and I vote, but always knowing that it's a turd with 2 different colored tips.
Sure.
On one side you have red, and on the other one you have blue. They're all bought and sold and traded by all these interests, and I often think pretty soon, maybe in my lifetime, and certainly in yours, we will see the Senate and the House with these guys that'll come in dressed in NASCAR driver outfits with the logos.
Yeah,
right?
you say the Cuba is a it's a family-owned business. I think the United States, it's just a slightly more complex.
Yeah, it's more complex and probably more families than just one,
But
right?
more of a cartel, we'll say that.
Yeah. Right, more people involved. But, I came to realize that what my parents did was, in fact, kind of a sacrifice, right? Which I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it ever hit me that way. If you said to me, you need to move your entire family someplace else, I'm not sure how I would react to that. But their reaction was instant and automatic, and they went for it. And here we are. My mother ended up leaving her entire family in Cuba because, unlike my father's family, they were with Castro, the majority of them, not so much with Batista, right? So, and it makes sense. My uncle, my dad had been street beat cops for Batista, and they didn't have any, as far as I know, no skeletons in their closet. I mean, I don't think they ever harassed or beat up people or certainly killed people. But, it was understood. Oh, Batista was a good guy. This guy is no good. My dad kind of liked Franco. My dad kind of liked Pinochet, right? He was always talking about how wonderful things were in Chile, and it's like I don't understand. So, to make a long story short, I think what happens to Cubans is that they don't fully understand. They haven't read the history to get the nuanced way that people think and vote politically in this country. They just react to whoever sort of.
Or understanding the United States' own pretty messy history with Cuba as well, because of the fucked up shit that we've done to Cuba.
Yeah, well, but you tell them, look, the Republicans, I understand you have a right to vote Republican and you have your own history with both parties, but the Republicans are really playing you. You know, they eat your Cuban food at a restaurant. Reagan did it really well, and they love Reagan. And it's like, I'm gonna find a way to free Cuba, and it's like, 65 years later or whatever. I don't do math, but from 59 to the present, it's like, man. Those Castro brothers have put to bed a lot of American presidents, and they will continue to, because until further notice, they'll be there for a long time.
So when you arrived, we think of both Miami and Los Angeles now as being these multicultural cities. Was it like that's already when you arrived?
No, Miami. I mean, Miami was, I would say, at the time, if you compared Miami to a place like New York or LA, it was a fledgling. I would say it looked like a city, but it still had kind of a town feel to it, right? There were certain neighborhoods in certain areas. Now Miami is all out on competing, becoming Little Manhattan. I mean, even what they've done to Coral Gables. Coral Gables is going to eventually rival Miami's downtown. That's how quickly things are going up. And also that they're out of real estate. So the only way to build is up. So they're buying like off of Lejeune and Flagler. They're buying up all these little quaint shops that made Miami have that town feel, and now they're putting up skyscrapers and these fancy apartments and all of that. And also the traffic has gone crazy, which is the reason why, my wife and I decided to make this our forever home, even though we're going to travel a lot. After I retire, this is where we're going to live. Just because I realized, and this comes with age, how long do you want to spend in the car? Yeah. And again, don't get me wrong, I like the car because I often will have my camera and I zigzag, I shark it, like my girls say that I'm doing. Because Miami is a grid, you're not going to get lost. But if you feel like you're getting lost, then you're going to end up seeing some interesting things. So I take pictures of people's altars in Hialeah. Mm-hmm. Cubans have, especially if they have that dual belief system of African and then Cuban, mm-hmm. right? They'll have these big shrines in their gardens. So I take pictures of those. I've been doing it for years. But even that is changing because Miami is changing. The old guard, the old Cubans are dying. And now, the Cubans that are in Miami are having children who then come to school or go away from school for school, and they come back and they go, oh, you know what, this is too crazy for me. I think I'm going to move to someplace else, So things change that way. The problem that I have with people leaving the state, and particularly young people leaving the state, is that it's a kind of a harsh brain drain. Once the young people leave, you're only left the old people, and that begets us God's waiting room, which is what most people call Florida. Or certain parts in Florida, for like. Sure. Century City.
Century City, yeah.
Century City, God's waiting room.
Yeah, the suburbia hell that is the turnpike in the middle of the state, all of that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a place that's growing, but
and it's amazing. Like, I grew up in South Florida and in Homestead, and just how fast it's.
Oh man, I taught at South Dade.
I went to South Dade. I graduated from South Dade.
What year?
2001. I had to think about it.
Oh. Actually, no. My wife and I, that's where we met. We were there in 1989 she lasted until 91. I lasted one semester.
Yeah.
I had a nervous breakdown and
I don't blame you.
I had to get out.
Yeah.
But I do remember the drives. We would wake up at 4, to be in Homestead by 7 o'clock in the morning.
That's crazy.
Coming from Hialeah, me Hialeah, and she Coral Gables.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay.
But it's definitely changed. And what was LA like in that time frame, culturally?
LA was huge, and depending on where you found yourself, very scary. But the older I got, the more I began to feel like, not that I belonged in those places, but I kind of like driving through, like Skid Row. I mean, downtown LA was a no man's land. People worked there like any major city downtown, but at night, after everything closed, then it was a kind of a free-for-all on the streets. And my friends and I would go to this place called Tommy's Hamburgers, and to get there, you had to cut through Skid Row. And so I saw firsthand how people, and that scene hasn't changed in this long. I mean, you're still always going to be homeless in certain parts of town. The other thing I do remember, and I think it made me a better driver, was that wherever you went in LA in a car, you had to get one of those maps. You had to look exactly where you were going, and then you learn how to get there, because LA is not a grid.
Right.
LA is like, what are we going to call this street? Oh, Sycamore? Perfect. That's what we're going to
And
call it.
everything curves.
Just put it on the map.
Yeah.
Whereas with Florida, I mean, Miami, and many bigger cities in Florida, they used a grid system like New York, and I still felt very lost, but it made a little bit more sense, to me. But I enjoyed. I don't drive in LA. That's the other new thing. This last time I was there about 5 years ago, and I rented a car, and the speed in LA, it's not for me. That is some hardcore, fast moving. People are always complaining about bumper to bumper traffic, but when it opens up, oh, you better, and you're trying to merge? No, you have to merge already going at 65.
Right.
So you got to have a car, because they have these lights on the on these merging lanes where you wait, and then it turns green, and you better be going 65 in seconds. So I guess you'd have to have a Corvette, any car that could go from 0 to 65 in a couple of seconds. You'll make it. So,
when did you first start writing, and what was your sort of your writing experience as a younger person?
it was around that time. I must have been maybe 12, 13. I was already hiding out in my teacher's rooms. And just to give you an example, they had 1 year, I don't know if it was a school thing or if it was my teacher who did it, but we had hobby day. Mm-hmm. And so everybody brought in their hobbies. I remember a kid who brought in his collection of doorknobs and model cars and all kinds of stuff that I kind of like stamps. I brought my stamps. Some kids brought in comic books. And, I started thinking, I have these hobbies, right? And one of them was that I wrote. I started writing, right? At this point, I think I was reading people like Edgar Allan Poe, who I found extremely, the only word I can think of is extremely delicious, because I knew enough already of the English to get the rhyme and to get those weird kind of morbid / goth poems. I think Edgar Allan Poe was the original goth. And I really loved it. I took a liking to him, and I thought, if it's good for Poe, it's good for me. And I started writing really creepy, I would say maybe even sci-fi poetry initially. And then, of course, I fell in love with this girl who, of course, didn't love me back. Her name was Tana Breedlove. I don't know whatever happened to Tana Breedlove.
That's great that you still know her name.
Yeah, I do. She was, again, a first love, first crush, whatever you want to call it. But here was the thing, the other thing that I didn't understand. It was a time when fashion, not that fashion is not important now, but back in the day, the school was split into three. You had the kids who were kind of in gangs and they wore their uniforms. And then you had the Hollywooders, right? And then you had the glam kids. So the Hollywooders were probably in cahoots with somebody like Elton John, and then the other side was David Bowie, I was in no man's land. I mean, I think I was still wearing my three-piece denim suit.
Three-piece denim
because
suit.
my mother always wanted me to look good, which I don't understand.
Just a
Anyway,
contrast for those who can't see, I've only ever known you in exactly what you're wearing now.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
That makes me proud.
Yes.
Sweatpants and a T-shirt. As a matter of fact, I told my wife, I go, if anything ever happens to me, please don't let my mother convince a mortician to put a suit on me. I need to go out in comfy boxer shorts, a T-shirt, and a pair of socks on my feet, just in case.
Just in case.
Of inclement weather, you know. But anyway, this girl said to me, "Oh, you know, you don't look like anything. You need to decide if you're a Hollywooder or a glam person, blah, blah, blah." Meaning you either have to be in cahoots with Elton John or David Bowie. And I like them both. But it's like, no, I want to be my own. I don't run. I'm kind of a lone wolf.
Sure.
The fact that you made me take showers for the first time in this country with 100 other people, I hate groups. I'm going to stand alone, you know. But I started writing, I think, at 13. And in notebooks, I was also drawing. I was very interested in art. I took a drafting class because I thought maybe even an architect. But the drafting teacher he introduced me to two amazing tools. He introduced me to Prismacolor pencils and then the rapidograph pens. And that was it. I went off on a kind of a color ink journey that I still do. I still do a lot of ink and Prismacolor work. And that was it. Those two things went in hand forever and ever. When I wrote my novels, I put my blinders on, and that's all I was doing. I stopped doing poetry. I stopped doing art. Then I think by that point I was already teaching here. And so poetry kind of started sneaking back in part because when you have two kids and you have to do X number of soccer matches a week and you have to do all of this stuff, then I felt like poetry was a lot more, not more fun, but it was part of my regular schedule. So I got on write a poem a day, if not write a poem a week, and that took off.
But you started with poetry?
I did start with poetry. It's just that even through all of my graduate work, I was always fiction. I mean, I took a couple of poetry workshops. I took screenwriting. I took playwriting. But it was always fiction in those workshops. That was the official thing that I showed people. And then the poetry I kind of did on the side. And eventually I started writing more poems and feeling like they were fairly decent poems. And I started sending them out, and then they started getting published. I worked on the first book. The thing with my poetry, which is also true of my fiction, I've never published a book with the same publisher twice, which I've kind of liked. Except for University of Pittsburgh, who's published my last two books. But I kind of like the idea of always, because after a while, I get a little insecure. It's like, oh, you're only publishing this book because you published the previous one, and maybe you like me and my stuff. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you always have to find a new audience for your book kind of appeals to me.
Okay.
Because it makes me feel like, okay, you know, if you're going to do a statistical analysis, like, oh, well, a lot of people like your stuff.
And it keeps you honest.
Yeah, and it keeps me honest. So, but yeah, poetry is the thing that now I have that I've with me, along with the art that I do on a regular basis, in part because it's become my routine, you know.
So when I taught creative writing, to high school students, and when I was a high school student learning to write, I definitely started with poetry, and most of my students want to start with poetry because they view it as this short, concise, relatively easy thing to grasp. But I'm a terrible poet, and most people are, I think. And so I sort of developed this cycle where most of my students would start with poetry because they can play with the words, but then they move to fiction because then you can build your own stories, but then they matured into a nonfiction sort of writing base. But the best writers seem to always circle back to poetry.
Well, I was going to ask you, did you, in any other time that you were writing poetry, did it ever occur to you that maybe you would try maybe lyrics to do
Oh, of
songs.
course. Yes, I did try.
Because I that is one thing, and I've given it a good try as an adult. I mean, I've given it a good try, and I'm horrible at it, right? Especially coming up with blues lyrics, which end up being ridiculous, or even worse, hip hop. I'm too old for hip hop, but I mean, it's what I bring to the classroom. Where if I begin to suspect that, for example, most of the poetry students come at the undergraduate level not really having a big experience being poetry readers. So along with getting them to read more poetry, I also tell them, look, maybe you will suck at writing poetry, but give your hand, try your hand at writing lyrics, in particular if you're musically inclined.
Right.
Now, in the last 10 years, I've been trying to learn how to play the guitar. And not that I know any better how to play the guitar, but I'm beginning to think that if I had had the right guidance at one time, where I would have had a teacher who would have said to me, you're writing these god-awful love poems, but forget the poem part of it. See if you can sit down and write a song, and also learn to play an instrument and play it.
Well, I think that something that I've always appreciated about the best teachers, I'm including in there, and I can remember your classes specifically, we never started exactly with the mode that we were going to be working with. I remember one semester you showed us a documentary about the MPAA and why these movies are rated R versus whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And then one semester you showed us, and I use this in my classroom, the Gregory Crutzen documentary, and there's always the moment of like, what are we doing this for? But exposing to different perspectives, different types of art, different types of media. I mean, why do you return to those different
I thrive
modalities?
on it because I tend to be like, I think most people are this way. I am prone to great boredom and long periods of boredom, and I hate to be bored. And I remember somebody said to me a long time ago, I don't know if it was Leo Buscaglia or one of these hip psychoanalysts in the media, says if you're bored is because you're boring to be with or to be around. And I go, damn, I'm going to try my best to keep up. So, and I tell my students, open yourself up. I mean, you don't have to intake your fascination of the world via one genre. Open yourself up. I mean, I love movies. I love documentaries. I love music. I try to listen to a variety of music. And some of it comes at me out of the blue. And I'll give you an example. I've known about this man named Sun Ra for years, for decades. When I was younger, I liked rock a lot more than I thought I would ever like jazz, right? But Sun Ra is this amazing, Sun Ra's Orchestra. That's the name of the oven through Pandora. Every night I listen to him nonstop. But what it is that Sun Ra was a little touched. He was a little eccentric. And I wish I could have watch them live because everybody would have these costumes and these amazing setups. But what I liked about it and what I'm reacting to now is that Sun Ra had an ability to bring in all of these strange sounds or quote unquote foreign instruments to the orchestra to make music that sounded really cool, but also that made you wonder, what is this I'm listening to, right? A lot of it is about space. So he was out there floating. And so I like discovering, or I like feeling like I'm discovering, at least to me, somebody that's new and who is going to energize me. And this is true of anybody. Whether it's somebody like Klaus Kinski or Wim Wenders, any of these guys. What's the name of the German documentary filmmaker? Not Von Buell, oh God. He had a commercial recently for one of these master classes, and he sounds like this. He goes, looking at the camera, it's like staring at your own death.
Is that Werner Herzog?
Werner Herzog, yes.
That impersonation was
David
great.
Lynch, all of these guys. I mean, I've been watching David Lynch. David Lynch has got these YouTube videos that I've been meaning to poke fun of and make myself wear. He's in the dark, right? Of course, he's got probably a home studio. He's shooting himself, and with his poofy hair, and he's smoking cigarettes and then saying a couple of odd words every like 5 minutes. Yeah, because sometimes the night finds you with a cigarette in your mouth, and then I go, you can only get away with this because you're freaking David Lynch, man. But it's beautiful, right? It's sort of odd stuff. I love YouTube for that reason, that I can punch in stuff. And a whole new world is. And to me, as a poet or as a painter or what have you, I like being excited about, and you mentioned Gregory Crewdson, who again is not, if you're going to be a photographer, is not the person that you want to emulate, because you don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend
Like a whole
on
film crew.
on a whole film crew. But hey, he does it. More power to him. But it's that carrot that you begin to dangle, and I think we all need those carrots dangling in front of us, not only to keep us from getting bored, but to go beyond the fear of the blank page or the blank canvas or whatever it is that you're not doing, right? So it's not only discipline, but then also searching for the people that that are gonna really.
So how did you manage your boredom during the pandemic, I'm wondering?
Oh, no, for me, it was perfect. I mean, the pandemic, had it caught me as a young person, so I totally feel, my heart goes out to my students and everybody who was younger than, let's say, 30 during the pandemic. But for me, it was perfect, because you're looking at a guy who already had a routine and who was already home. So it was a matter of literally getting out of bed, brushing my teeth, getting the coffee going, and then getting a shitload of work done day in and day out. So I didn't really feel it the way that I think, had I been young, right? I mean, I'd ordered the food to arrive at the house. I would order the stuff from the market. I learned to cook new dishes. Everything was home central for me, and I kind of like it, right? Which has probably put on a few more pounds that I should be carrying. But I thought it was perfect. Philosophically, I guess, the thing that I wanted to get, not only me, but the whole country, the whole world, was that you don't have to work as hard as people work in this country, right? So it was a good chance to talk about how many hours are you working and what are you getting out of that work, right? And of course, most people would say money, which is totally understandable. But the other thing is, it's time. It's a facility, that you get from sliding out of bed onto the computer and then not really. I mean, think about it. Guys don't put that much time into what they wear, but most women I know, to go off to work, that's going to put an extra hour or so on their schedule that you don't have to do it during a pandemic. So of course, I didn't like people dying and all of that, but I didn't have to wear a mask because I didn't go anywhere. I didn't see anybody. I did a lot of FaceTime. I did a lot of Zoom. So for an old fart like me, I kind of liked it. I like being home.
I think that you're touching on something that I know that intellectually I have been sort of grappling with, and that is privilege is like one of these words that are really tossed around a lot. And I think that what we're really talking about when we talk about people being privileged, those folks have more time to do things. Like money grants you the time to do whatever it is that you want to do. And I think that most people don't really have a genuine appreciation for whether it's work time, spare time, free time, independent time. And I do think that you're right that for at least for a few minutes, maybe, when the pandemic was really in full swing, like everybody had a chance to sort of take a deep breath and experience what that time could be like.
I heard from a lot of people who were having issues, including some of my daughter's friends who were alone in a city that they had moved to, and it got to them, and I could see it, right? If you can't go anywhere, you're home 24/7. I could see that how that could be very problematic. But you're married, you have your partner in the house, you have a lot of I mean, you could do. A lot of people learn to cook new stuff just to keep going, right? And again, there's some people who don't have that kind of privilege, and I wonder about them and their fate. That the fact that the apartment renters, right? What happens if you can't pay your rent, right? If you can't go to work, then you can't pay your rent, and so I mean, socially, it became a nightmare for a lot of people. But myself, I was okay. I mean, and everybody I knew. My mother, I wish she would have been here, even though she would have driven me crazy. But she's 80. She's 82 now, going on to 83, and she was alone. But again, the new technologies, I think, saved us to a certain extent. It's like I can't imagine being old and not knowing how to FaceTime. That's going to make for a very kind of extra lonely existence. But some people, I mean, I listen to Lewis Black, as I'm sure you do, and Lewis is always saying, I'm glad, isn't it great? I walk into the apartment and then I look for, I want to hear some sounds, but it's just silence. Oh, beautiful silence. I love silence. And to me, that would be kind of horrible, because I like being around the people that I love. And I don't really need to go anywhere to get human companionship, at least not yet. And I hope not ever. But the friends that I have and the family that I have kept me going all this time.
And as you're talking about your family and your kids, and now you're a grandfather, as you look at that sort of through line from your parents to you and to your kids, and now their kids, what is it that you're seeing as sort of the thread that connects all of that? Like what?
It's we started talking about immigration. It's what happens to people, whether they want to or not, once they arrive in this country. You have that first generation that often will have to go through a lot of sacrifice to then send that next generation to school, whether they end up in college or not, but they might end up getting jobs or inventing something, and next thing you know, they're doing all right. And then those kids will not have any connection to the grandparents, because the grandparents are old world. Oftentimes they even speak a different language. And so it's the continuity of how people kind of merge.
Do you find yourself surprised at all ever if you see something from your parents that you didn't want to inherit, or that you did, or you're just surprised to find when you were dealing with your own children?
The hardest thing was for me to make sure that I was always conscious of the things that my parents did to me that I did not like, i.e., belittling me to a certain extent. My parents, again, only child. They wanted me to be a doctor, attorney, accountant, architect, dentist, anything but a freaking poet, right? Because they were worried about how are you going to make a living, right? For many years, I got away with telling them that I was going to become a journalist, which was a big lie. I'm not for hire to tell somebody else's story. I want to tell my story, right? So I knew I would never become a journalist. But for a while, they kind of liked that lie, and we were okay. But the idea that, why are you doing this? Kind of, it made me feel very self-conscious and full of doubt. And so I promised myself that I would never do that to my children, regardless of what they wanted to be. Like my youngest daughter is a fantastic artist. She has a gift. She is math and science oriented. She's a chemist. My oldest daughter is a forensic archivist. And it's like, what the hell is that? I'm still learning what that is. So I never meddle that way. It's like, whatever you want to become, you can become, right? And the problem with my mother, to give you a very specific example, is that my mother was so old world that she would always tell the girls, yeah, a lot of education, but remember that you learn to cook. You need to learn to cook. You need to learn to sew. All of these old world things. And my wife would go crazy, and she'd say, well, tell your mother not to tell the girls that kind of horrible. So, and I would tell the girls, you guys don't have to do any of that stuff. Don't listen to grandma, Because in fact, who would listen to grandma?
Right.
Grandma was out of date.
But at the same time, are there things culturally culturally that you feel that you or maybe they have missed out on from Cuba or from before?
Well, hopefully, and one of the big things on my bucket list is to go to Cuba with my daughters, and of course, it's so late in the game now that they're probably going to come to Cuba with me and their families, and their children, which would be great. And then for me, it'll be tough because all of the people in my family are probably either half dead or dying, or it's the younger generation that I don't know because I haven't been to Cuba since I left. But I like that idea that those worlds colliding, and I think it could in fact happen. The funny thing is that my daughters are not Cuban nationals. I'm a Cuban national regardless of whether I'm an American citizen or not. The minute I set foot in Cuba, they acknowledge me as a Cuban national and not an American citizen, and that's the reason why I haven't gone back, because I want to feel like if something goes wrong, and again, my writing is not political, but some of it is, right? So I arrive in Cuba and all of a sudden, oh, we were waiting for you, that kind of thing. It's like, what am I going to do? Call the embassy and tell them, can you get me out? It's like, yeah, no, not really.
No.
So then I'm screwed. And I'm paranoid enough to feel that way. And in other words, I do not give up my American citizenship to any country just because, and it makes sense. I mean, I was born in Cuba, but I'm an American citizen now. I'm not a Cuban citizen. So that's my only, but eventually, like I tell you, that family that runs the Cuban government, eventually they too will either soften or give up because time.
Yeah.
So
I find this. I sympathize with the fear or the anxiety of transmitting that own similar ideas of parental shame that I received from my parents. Do this, do that. You're not good enough in this or that or whatever. How do you find yourself is writing your do you explore that in your writing? Do you think, like, I just find the topic of shame to be particularly powerful because it's something that we're pushed to not discuss out loud.
Yeah, well, a lot of it, I mean, at the personal level, and this is something that we have to deal with in the workshops all the time, right? What happens to you as a writer when you remember something? Let's say you're doing creative nonfiction or you're doing a poem, or to a certain extent even a story, but you're basing it on something that has perhaps happened to you, and that it has to do with a family member, right? And then the person doing the writing often feels inhibited because they don't want to talk about it, but certainly they don't want to talk about it in such direct terms that the person they're writing about would know that it's them, right? But my solution to that is write it, and then depending on the genre, if it's fiction, you've seen that disclaimer. This story is based on, even though it's a true story, some of the factuals have been scrambled, right, for the benefit of the people in it. So. And some of it, I mean, with my own experience, has to do with maybe a memory I remember, including memories of my own parents that I think was something that I misunderstood, and now that I'm an adult, I'm understanding, right? And I've written about it. And I think it has a lot to do with maturity and time, right? One time I walked in on my parents when I must have been 7 or 8. I was having a nightmare. And so I ran into the room. They didn't lock the door. And so my mother's on her knees, my father's standing over her. My mother's face is red. I'm almost paraphrasing what I've written, right? And I recoiled from that scene. And in my mind, I said, oh, my father is hitting or abusing my mother somehow. Oh, terrible, right? And it did have an impact on my relationship with my father, in that being an only son and being the son of this Cuban man, I was not going to entertain any tomfoolery about other women, or, because it's like, I love my mother, I respect my mother, and I expect you to do the same thing. Years later, of course, when my own world, married world, and having children, I understood what was going on, and I go, oh shit, I passed judgment too early. We have the psychology now by which we can sit down with our children and explain to them what maybe they saw, right? That was not available to me. My parents didn't say a word the next day, and that stuck with me. It's like, what did I see? Was this part of the dream, or was this part of a reality that I thought was horrible, So
I find that conversation around language to be particularly interesting from a writing perspective, but just from a living perspective, and you're talking very generally around language and how it evolves. There's so much about psychology and gender that are so new, and I think our kids do have better tools and better words to describe that. But you also, I think, have something that so many Americans, especially I don't have, and that you're bilingual. And how does the language and the ability to flow between languages affect how you look at things, how you write?
It's a plus because I can mine two different worlds at the same time, right? And for me, going back to learning the language, right, I remember one of the first words that I learned was butterfly, right? And butterfly, we know it's a beautiful thing, right? But translating it back into Spanish, it ends up being crap. It's mantequilla mosca, right? Or mosca mantequilla. It's a compound word, two ugly words in Spanish that when you combine them, they make this word, beautiful word in English. And to me, that's always been my little green light. It's like, I want to do that. I want to mix the languages in hopes that I get my point across, or that I tell a story that will at one point be kind of universal, but at the other will make the reader think about their own experience and their own journeys and things that happen to us that we don't, we'll never understand. And I think that's what begins to turn you into a writer, right? You're a bucket that begins to fill with all of these strange things. And you try, I think most normal people who are not writers, they just kind of dismiss it. And it's like, oh, that was a strange thing that happened. But I tend to be a little bit more superstitious, right? Like I stopped drinking. I was young, thank heavens. I stopped drinking the day I woke up in the backseat of a car, of a 69 Nova, and across the street, I saw this man who looked like a woman, but it was a man dressed like a woman, and he was shampooing his hair while waiting for the bus to arrive. And again, normal people would say, oh, that was very strange, right? Or a photographer, if you had can I take a picture of you? But with me, it was, I took it as a sign. It's like, the world is already pretty weird and beautiful without you having to put alcohol in your system, And I'm always telling students that don't go down the road of, let's say, a Jim Morrison or even an Edgar Allan Poe. Anybody who claims that in order to be a great writer and a great artist, you have to punish your mind. Like, I'm not of that school. Keep your brain, Dylan says it best. Your mind is your temple. Keep it beautiful and clean. And I believe that.
Well, and I think that communication is hard enough as it is, right? Because you can't be in my brain, I can't be in yours, and so this substitution that we use as language, which is by definition symbolic, it's hard enough.
Yeah, it is hard enough. One language is hard enough. I was talking to my students today about the nature of love making in whatever language you are from, and you stumble upon. I mean, you want to be contemporary, so. You're writing your sex scenes or what have you. You want to be as accurate as possible. And then all of a sudden you start thinking about those dirty words, and not a single one of them is a good word. Because I think since the beginning of time, we have given the most horrible names to these, like genitalia. I mean, it's like horrible shit. Hundreds of different names. For these things. And so when you're a writer, it's like, what am I going to call it? How am I going to be specific here? And so I think it becomes a challenge to find the right word to be able to describe what you're trying to do in a poem or in a story. So,
do you enjoy that process though?
I do, and I laugh. I mean, I am foul-mouthed every chance that I get in class. I'm always saying god-awful stuff. But just when I thought I would never fall in love with another word, I started listening to Amy Winehouse, who introduced me to, I think it's been the word of the decade for me so far, fuckery. What kind of fuckery is this, right? I think it's in one of her songs. And I go, oh my God, of all the manipulations of fuck, I love fuckery. That's what these politicians are doing. That's what's going on in this world. Pure fuckery. And then I start using it. And so it's kind of fun. You keep your lists.
Your list of the best words.
Yeah, of the best words.
Do you still enjoy teaching? I mean, you've been in the classroom for a while.
I enjoy teaching, although, again, I'm becoming much more, and this is another thing that the pandemic showed me, is that I love teaching face-to-face. I like the energy of being in the classroom. But, I'm running out of, as I like to call it, material. My jokes are no longer funny. I've left many generations behind with my stupid humor. And also the stuff that we riff on as teachers over time. If this story worked for this class, it's going to work for another class. And over time, you realize that is not true. I'm also getting a little tired, and I want to spend more time with my grandchildren, grandchild so far, but I get the feeling there's going to be more. And also to do the work. I'm working on a new book, and I'm doing some paintings, and it's keeping me going. I'm having a good time, But I'm old. I mean, it's like the reverse. You know how people say, "Oh, 80s is the new 40s." It's like with me, it's the other. My 61 is already 92, man, and I'm feeling it.
One of the things that I'm really interested in is the concept of home, and what do we think of as home? Is it permanent? Is it a mindset? So if you could tell me what you think about when you think of home.
Home is everything. Home is where my work is. Home is where the family is. This home is sort of the memories, right? When they tell you, you have a 30-year mortgage, right? You initially think, oh my God, that's a shitload of money. But what you're doing is you are growing roots, and also you are creating these memories that have only happened here, like this porch, which we just refinished. And by we, I mean whoever did it. I didn't do it. But there are a lot of good times that have happened here. So it's family and friends, and then whatever work that really engages you, do it, and try to do it until the end of time. As we get older, we start thinking about things that we haven't figured out yet, which is, do I want to die in a hospital? I don't think so. I would like to die at home, and hopefully soon. I mean, I know it happens to a lot of people now, but society is opening up to the ideas like, why have you in a hospital? We'll give you the medicines and all of that, and you could die peacefully at home, surrounded by your family. And that's, I think that's the continuity. A house is the continuity. And of course, the house is an estate. This is the state in which I've lived the longest, all of my life. So yeah, it's a house in Florida, and I'm a Floridian, and I don't have plans to go anywhere. So this is kind of my turf, and the kids know that, and I think their kids will know that, right? You always hear those stories of a family that sold their house in Wyoming or what have you, and then you make a journey back to show the kids where you were born, and you have to ask for permission. Well, hopefully that's not going to happen here, because we will be in this house. If I could get buried in the cemetery back here in the yard somewhere, I would, but maybe with a permit, but probably not, because the well is right underneath. So.
And the flip side of that is, when you're not here, where do you like to be? Like where in the world? Where's your?
Where my daughters are. I mean, my wife and I divide our time these days. We're always ping-ponging between here and St. Pete, and then here in Austin. And again, you can never think that it might not happen, but eventually the grandchildren grow up, and then it might be a whole group of us who then have to go and visit the grandchild wherever he or she might be. So to me, it's pure continuity. It's what I know, the place I kind of love, and where I get some good living done, and that to me is home.
That's it for this episode, and thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions or ideas for future episodes, please contact me via social media or at finloslives@gmail.com. Or you can leave me a voicemail via the SpeakPipe app at finloslives.com. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider sharing this episode or joining us on Patreon. I look forward to talking with you next time.